Well, in this video, we're going to ask the question, does God always keep his promises? As you read the Bible, you'll discover that the Bible is full of promises. But sometimes in our life, it can feel like, man, I read a promise here in the Bible, but yet God doesn't seem to be coming through on that in my own personal experience in life. And so sometimes we can wonder, can we really trust God at his word? Does he really keep all of his promises? Well, first, let me just say right off the bat, yes, God always keeps his promises. We never have to doubt that. We can be absolutely confident that when God makes a promise to us, he will always come through on his word. Look what it says in the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, chapter 23 and verse 19. It says, God is not a man, so he doesn't lie. He is not human, so he does not change his mind. Has he ever spoken and failed to act? Has he ever promised and not carried it through? The author here is asking kind of a rhetorical question where the answer is obviously, well, of course not. God always comes through. We can trust God absolutely, and the Bible assures us of that. But in order to understand this, we have to understand some really important principles about the promises of God. Because often our frustration comes not because God hasn't come through on his word, but because we have misunderstood a promise in the Bible. So here are some important things to keep in mind when it comes to understanding the promises of God. First is this: some promises are limited and for specific people. Not every promise in the Bible applies to every person in the world. For example, look at 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 5. Here's a promise regarding King David. It says this: "Then I will establish the throne of your dynasty over Israel forever. For I made this promise to your father David. One of your descendants will always sit on the throne of Israel." See, this was a promise that was specifically related to the lineage of David and that one of his descendants would sit on the throne of Israel. Now, this isn't a promise that I can apply to myself and say, oh, good, God made this promise, so I'm going to sit on the throne of Israel someday. No, this was to a specific person and time and place. And so we have to make sure we always read the context and see, is this promise limited? Secondly, we have to understand that some promises are absolutely unconditional. These are promises that God has made that no matter what happens, this is going to be the case. Genesis chapter 9 verse 11 is a great example of this. This is God's promise after the flood. It says this: "Yes, I am confirming my covenant with you. Never again will flood waters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth." God made this unconditional promise that never again would he flood the whole world like he did early in the book of Genesis. And there are many other unconditional promises in the Bible. But there are also many promises in the Bible that are conditional. That means that God makes a promise, but there is a condition that has to be met in order for that promise to be experienced. For example, in the New Testament, James chapter 4 and verse 7, it says, "So humble yourself before God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." God says this: when you're dealing with temptation, if you will humble yourself and if you resist the devil, well, then he will flee from you. You see, God promises this support in times of temptation, but it doesn't come automatically. It comes when we have met that condition. And many promises of God in the Bible have a condition. There is an if or whoever or when you do this, then this will happen. So if there's a promise and you're not feeling like it's being experienced in your life, ask yourself if you've met the condition of that promise. And finally, the last thing to understand is that a principle is different from a promise. You see, this is where a lot of people get confused. They read things in the Bible and they assume it's a promise from God, when in reality it's simply a general principle. This is very common in the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is full of very practical wisdom and all sorts of general principles for life, but they're not necessarily promises from God. A very commonly misunderstood one is Proverbs 22:6. It says this: "Direct your children onto the right path, and when they are older, they will not leave it." Some parents take that as a promise, meaning that as long as I do my job as a parent, then my kid will never screw up. He will never walk away. He will be a perfect angel. And they get disappointed or they feel let down by God if their kid ends up rebelling or walking away. You see, that is not a promise from God. That is a general principle that we can trust in, that the more we direct our children toward God and try to help them pursue God, in general, they're going to have a more positive experience in life. But that is not always the case. There are certainly exceptions. And so at the end of the day, yes, when God makes a promise and you meet all the conditions of that promise or that promise applies to you, yes, absolutely, God will keep his word. He will never let you down. But remember, not every promise in the Bible applies to everyone, and you have to make sure you understand, are there conditions upon this promise? So why don't you go ahead and pause now and discuss these questions.